You want to know what real power looks like? Watch me ground every plane in this airline's fleet with one phone call. It started with a 9-year-old boy's pink, glittery backpack and ended with an entire airline industry transformed, a gate agent facing federal charges, and a family teaching the world that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred isn't revenge, but the kind of grace that changes hearts forever. The air conditioning in Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3 was fighting a losing battle against the humid July afternoon, and the departure board looked like a Christmas tree gone wrong, with more red delayed flights than green on-time ones scattered across the electronic display. Gate K-14 was one of the rare bright spots, showing Flight 847 to Atlanta, still proudly displaying that miraculous green on-time status that made seasoned travelers do double takes in disbelief. Doctor. Jonathan Hayes adjusted the collar of his navy polo shirt and glanced down at his family, feeling that familiar mixture of pride and protectiveness that came with being a father in public spaces. His wife, Dr. Alicia Hayes, looked effortlessly elegant even in travel clothes, her natural lawyer posture evident in the way she carried herself while scrolling through emails on her phone. Their daughter Zoe, 12 years old and already showing signs of her mother's sharp intellect, was reading a book about civil rights history that she'd picked up for a summer project. And then there was Isaiah, 9 years old, with his father's gentle eyes and his mother's quick smile, currently engaged in what appeared to be a very serious conversation with his pink, glittery backpack. "You okay there, buddy?" Jonathan asked, kneeling down to Isaiah's eye level, a habit he'd developed during his military days when addressing younger subordinates. Isaiah looked up with the kind of earnest expression that only 9-year-olds could master, holding up his backpack like it was a treasured artifact. "I'm just making sure Mr. Sparkles is ready for the plane," Isaiah explained with complete sincerity. "Zoe said sometimes airline people can be mean about bags, so I want to make sure he's not too big or anything." The backpack in question was indeed glittery, a remnant from a phase where Isaiah had decided that pink was his favorite color, and anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with his dad. Jonathan had supported his son's choice completely, though he'd privately enjoyed the looks of confusion from other parents when Isaiah proudly showed off his sparkly accessories. Alicia looked up from her phone and smiled at the exchange, reaching over to ruffle Isaiah's carefully combed hair. "Your bag is perfect, sweetheart. It fits all the rules, and even if it didn't, we'd figure it out together." She had the kind of voice that could calm nervous witnesses or intimidate corporate executives, depending on the situation. And right now, it was pure maternal comfort. Jonathan stood back up, his experienced traveler's eye automatically scanning the gate area with the kind of observational habits that 20 years in the Air Force and 8 years with the Federal Aviation Administration had drilled into his very DNA. He noticed the worn carpet near the jet bridge entrance, the flickering fluorescent light above the gate desk that was probably violating some maintenance protocol. And most importantly, he noticed the people. There was an elderly woman struggling with a walker that the gate agent was clearly eyeing with impatience, a young mother trying to juggle twin toddlers while managing a diaper bag that looked like it could supply a small army, and several business travelers who had that particular look of resigned frustration that came with frequent flying in the modern age. Jonathan also noticed that he and his family were among the very few black passengers in the first-class boarding area, an observation that he'd learned to make automatically after years of being the only person of color in military briefings, corporate meetings, and airport lounges. Dad, Zoe said, looking up from her book with the kind of thoughtful expression that usually preceded a question that would make Jonathan proud and slightly nervous at the same time. "Why do you think some people treat others differently just because of how they look?" It was the kind of question that could have come from her reading, but Jonathan suspected it came from the same observational skills that ran in the family. Jonathan sat down in the plastic airport chair next to his daughter, considering his answer carefully. "Well, sweetheart, sometimes people make assumptions based on what they think they know instead of taking the time to learn who someone really is. And sometimes those assumptions are influenced by things they've been taught or experiences they've had that have nothing to do with the person standing in front of them. That doesn't seem very fair, Isaiah chimed in, still clutching his backpack. Mom always says we should be nice to people until they give us a reason not to be. Alicia looked over at her son, with obvious pride, reaching over to squeeze his hand gently. Your mom is absolutely right, Jonathan agreed, though he was privately hoping that today would be one of those travel days where his family could just be regular passengers heading to a family celebration, instead of having to navigate the complex dynamics that seemed to follow them through certain spaces. His brother Marcus was finally getting promoted to brigadier general, and Jonathan wanted nothing more than to get to Atlanta, enjoy the ceremony, and give his kids a chance to see their uncle in his dress uniform, getting the recognition he'd earned through decades of dedicated service. The truth was, Jonathan could have avoided a lot of potential complications by simply flashing his federal credentials at the first sign of trouble. As a senior inspector with the FAA, he carried the kind of identification that made airline employees suddenly very cooperative and apologetic. But he'd learned over the years that using his position for personal convenience sent the wrong message to his children about entitlement and abuse of power. He wanted Zoe and Isaiah to see their father as someone who earned respect through his actions and character, not someone who intimidated people with his badge. Group 1 boarding for Flight 847 to Atlanta came the announcement over the gate's PA system, the voice crisp and professional. First-class passengers and active military personnel may now board. Jonathan gathered their modest carry-on bags, a habit from his military days when he'd learned to pack light and efficiently. Alicia had her sleek roller bag that somehow managed to contain everything she might need for a weekend trip, plus emergency legal briefs, and the kids had their backpacks loaded with books, tablets, and enough snacks to survive a minor apocalypse. As they approached the boarding line, Jonathan felt that familiar mixture of anticipation and mild anxiety that came with air travel. Not because he was nervous about flying, but because he'd learned to be alert to the subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways that his family might be treated differently than other passengers. He hoped today would be smooth, professional, and unremarkable. He had no way of knowing that in the next few minutes his quiet hope for an ordinary travel day was about to collide with someone who would turn this simple family trip into a moment that would change everything. Rebecca Walsh had been standing behind airline podiums for 18 years, and she could usually spot trouble passengers from 50 feet away, though her definition of trouble had evolved in ways that she wasn't entirely proud of and definitely wasn't willing to examine too closely. At 52, she had the kind of carefully maintained appearance that spoke of someone who took pride in her professional image, even when everything else in her life was falling apart piece by piece, like a puzzle being slowly destroyed. Her name tag read, Rebecca, Senior Gate Agent, a title that she'd earned through years of perfect attendance customer service scores that were technically adequate, and a willingness to work the shifts that other employees tried to avoid. What the name tag didn't reveal was that she'd been awake since 3 a.m, sitting in a hospital waiting room while doctors tried to stabilize her 78-year-old mother's blood pressure, or that she'd been fighting with insurance companies and Medicare representatives for the better part of 6 months to cover treatments that seemed to cost more every week. Rebecca had started working for Skyline Airlines when she still believed that customer service was about solving problems and making people's days a little bit brighter, back when she thought that being professional and efficient would be enough to build a stable career and a comfortable life. She'd been married then to a man who'd promised to support her dreams, and then gradually made it clear that her dreams were significantly less important than his need to feel superior to everyone around him. The divorce had been finalized 8 months ago, and the settlement had been just generous enough to cover her legal fees and just stingy enough to leave her scrambling to cover her mother's medical expenses. The stress had changed her in ways that she recognized but felt powerless to address. Where she'd once given passengers the benefit of the doubt, she now found herself looking for reasons to assert her authority and control over situations that often didn't require either. Where she'd once seen her job as helping people reach their destinations safely and comfortably, she now saw it as managing problems and maintaining order in a world that seemed increasingly determined to challenge her at every opportunity. Keith Rodriguez, her supervisor, was 29 years old and had been promoted to his position primarily because he had a college degree and a willingness to work overtime without complaining too much about the pay. He was a nice enough young man, but Rebecca had watched him fold under pressure more times than she could count, and she'd learned that, if she presented him with a situation that required him to choose between supporting her judgment or dealing with an angry passenger complaint, he would almost always take the path of least resistance. Rebecca's personal life had become a careful balancing act between work shifts and hospital visits, between maintaining her professional composure and dealing with the crushing reality of watching her mother's mind slip away a little more each day. The dementia was progressing faster than the doctors had predicted, and the assisted living facility that had seemed affordable 6 months ago was now stretching Rebecca's budget to the breaking point. She'd been at the hospital until 2 in the morning the night before, holding her mother's hand while a nurse explained that they'd need to increase her medication again, which meant another increase in costs that Rebecca couldn't really afford but couldn't bear to refuse. Her mother hadn't recognized her during the visit, calling her by the name of a sister who died 30 years ago, and Rebecca had driven home through empty Chicago streets, wondering when exactly her life had become so relentlessly difficult. The morning shift had started with a canceled flight that left her dealing with angry passengers for 3 hours, followed by a delay that had required her to rebook dozens of connections. And now she was looking at an afternoon of what appeared to be typical summer travel chaos. Her feet hurt from standing in shoes that needed to be replaced but weren't in the budget. Her back ached from leaning over the podium computer for hours at a time, and her patience was running dangerously thin in ways that she recognized but couldn't seem to control. When Rebecca saw the Hayes family approaching the gate area, her first thought wasn't about their race or their appearance, but about the fact that they looked like the kind of passengers who probably expected special treatment and wouldn't hesitate to complain to corporate if they didn't get it. The father was tall and carried himself with military bearing that suggested someone accustomed to being obeyed. The mother had the polished look of a professional woman who probably had lawyers on speed dial, and the children looked well-dressed and well-behaved in a way that somehow irritated Rebecca more than if they'd been running around screaming. She couldn't have articulated exactly why the sight of this obviously successful, obviously happy family made her feel defensive and slightly hostile, but she found herself looking for potential problems with their tickets, their luggage, or their behavior that might give her a legitimate reason to assert her authority over their travel experience. It wasn't conscious racism, at least not in her own mind, but it was something uglier and more insidious, a resentment born of her own disappointments and frustrations that had found a target in people who seemed to have the kind of life that she'd once thought she deserved. Rebecca didn't recognize that she was looking at a federal inspector, and his family didn't realize that the quiet dignity with which they carried themselves came from years of navigating spaces where they had to be twice as professional to receive half as much respect, and certainly didn't understand that she was about to make the kind of mistake that would transform her from a struggling single daughter trying to care for her sick mother into a cautionary tale about the price of letting personal pain turn into professional prejudice. The boarding process began with the kind of efficient choreography that airline passengers had learned to navigate through years of practice, with first-class passengers forming a neat line near the podium while economy passengers settled in for the familiar wait that was part of the modern travel experience. Flight 847's departure time was still holding steady at 4:45 p.m., a minor miracle in an afternoon that had seen delays cascade through the terminal like dominoes falling in slow motion. Rebecca Walsh positioned herself behind the podium with the practiced authority of someone who'd processed thousands of boarding passes, her scanner ready, and her customer service smile carefully arranged in the expression that airline training manuals described as professional but approachable. The reality was that her smile had become somewhat mechanical over the years, a professional mask that she wore regardless of her actual mood or energy level. First-class passengers and active military may now board, she announced into the microphone, her voice carrying across the gate area with the kind of crisp efficiency that suggested someone who took pride in maintaining order and keeping schedules on track. The Hayes family gathered their belongings and moved toward the line with the calm confidence of experienced travelers who'd learned to navigate airports without drama or complications. Jonathan reached the podium first, his boarding pass already pulled up on his phone in the way that frequent travelers had mastered to keep lines moving efficiently. The scanner beeped with the satisfying electronic chirp that indicated a successful scan, and Rebecca barely glanced up as she gestured him toward the jet bridge with the kind of automated courtesy that came from processing hundreds of passengers every shift. "Next," she said, and Alicia stepped forward with her own phone ready, receiving the same quick scan and professional nod that moved her toward the plane without any particular notice or comment. Zoe followed with the kind of composed behavior that suggested a child who'd been taught airport etiquette from an early age, her boarding pass scanning cleanly as she followed her parents down the jet bridge toward their seats. Then, Isaiah stepped up to the podium, clutching his pink, glittery backpack in one hand and holding his phone with his boarding pass in the other, his 9-year-old face serious with the concentration that children applied to important grown-up tasks like airline boarding. The scanner beeped successfully, indicating that his seat assignment was properly confirmed and his ticket was valid for the flight. "Hold on," Rebecca said, her voice cutting through the ambient terminal noise with a sharpness that made Isaiah freeze mid-step toward the jet bridge. "That bag. It's too big for a personal item." Her tone carried the kind of absolute authority that airline employees used when they decided to enforce a rule, regardless of whether the enforcement made logical sense in the specific situation. Jonathan stopped at the entrance to the jet bridge and turned around, his parental instincts immediately activated by the change in Rebecca's tone and the way his son had gone suddenly still at the podium. "Is there a problem?" he asked, walking back toward the gate area with the kind of controlled movement that suggested someone accustomed to handling unexpected situations calmly and efficiently. "The backpack is too large for a personal item," Rebecca declared, pointing at Isaiah's bag with the kind of definitive gesture that suggested someone who'd made up her mind and wasn't particularly interested in discussion or negotiation. "It needs to be checked. That'll be $75. The fee was substantial enough to be annoying, but not large enough to justify missing a flight over exactly the kind of charge that airlines had perfected to extract additional revenue while staying just below the threshold of outright passenger rebellion. Alicia looked at the bag in question, her legal training automatically engaging as she assessed the situation with the kind of analytical thinking that had made her successful in corporate law. "It's clearly within the size requirements," she said, her voice carrying the professional courtesy that she'd learned to use when dealing with unreasonable opposing counsel. "It's a child's backpack, and it's barely half full. Personal items are allowed to be 18 inches, and this is obviously smaller than that." Isaiah looked up at his parents with the kind of confused expression that children wore when adult behavior stopped making sense, still holding his backpack as if he wasn't quite sure whether he'd done something wrong or whether the grown-ups around him were having some kind of disagreement that he couldn't understand. The bag was clearly regulation size, a fact that was obvious to everyone in the immediate area, including other passengers who had started to pay attention to the exchange. "The bag is rigid," Rebecca insisted, crossing her arms in a gesture that suggested someone who'd decided to make this particular hill her battlefield, regardless of the logical merits of her position. "It won't compress under the seat. Airline policy requires that personal items be flexible enough to fit completely under the seat in front of you without encroaching on other passengers' space. Jonathan stepped closer to the podium, his height making him tower over the gate agent in a way that might have been intimidating if his body language hadn't remained completely non-threatening and professional. "Ma'am, I measured this bag myself this morning. It's 14 inches tall, well within the 18-inch limit for personal items. It's also soft-sided and designed specifically for airline travel." His voice carried the kind of quiet authority that came from years of military training and federal employment, though he was being careful to keep his tone respectful and non-confrontational. "I didn't ask for your measurements." Rebecca snapped her voice, taking on the kind of sharp edge that suggested someone whose patience had been worn thin by circumstances that had nothing to do with the current situation. "I am the gate agent, and I decide what goes on this aircraft. The bag is too bulky. The policy is clear, and the fee is $75 if you want it to travel in the cabin." Zoe had been watching the exchange with the kind of intense observation that intelligent children applied to adult behavior that seemed illogical or unfair, and she spoke up with the kind of direct question that cut through adult posturing and went straight to the heart of the matter. "Excuse me, but why are you being mean to my brother? His bag is smaller than mine, and you didn't say anything about mine when I walked through." The question hung in the air with the particular power that came from childhood honesty, confronting adult inconsistency. And for a moment, Rebecca found herself looking at a 12-year-old girl who was pointing out the obvious unfairness of her position, with the kind of clear-eyed logic that was difficult to argue against. Other passengers in the boarding area had begun to notice the exchange, some of them pulling out their phones in the reflexive modern response to situations that appeared to be escalating beyond normal customer service interactions. The tension at gate K14 had shifted from a simple customer service disagreement to something more charged and complicated, with the kind of energy that made experienced travelers look up from their phones and start paying attention to what was happening at the podium. Jonathan moved with deliberate calm to position himself next to his son, placing a protective hand on Isaiah's shoulder while keeping his voice level and professional. "Ma'am, if there's a question about the bag size..." "I'm happy to demonstrate that it fits within regulation," Jonathan said, reaching for the clear plastic sizing bin that was attached to every gate podium for exactly this purpose. The FAA requires that personal items fit within specific dimensions, and I can show you that this bag meets those requirements. His tone was patient, but firm, the voice of someone who understood rules and procedures and expected them to be applied consistently and fairly. Rebecca watched as Jonathan easily slid Isaiah's backpack into the sizing bin where it fit with several inches to spare on every side, demonstrating beyond any reasonable doubt that the bag was well within the allowed dimensions for personal items. The visual evidence was clear and irrefutable, witnessed by the growing crowd of passengers who were now openly watching the interaction unfold. "It's not about the size," Rebecca said, her voice rising slightly as she shifted her justification in the way that people did when they'd committed to a position that they couldn't logically defend. "It's about policy. The bag is structured, and structured bags require additional screening and handling. There are safety protocols that have to be followed, and those protocols require additional fees to ensure proper processing and security compliance." The explanation was bureaucratic nonsense, and everyone within hearing distance knew it, but Rebecca had fallen back on the airline employee's ultimate defense, the appeal to mysterious policies that passengers couldn't challenge because they didn't have access to the internal procedures manual. It was a tactic that usually worked because most travelers would rather pay an unreasonable fee than miss their flight arguing about regulations. Alicia stepped forward with her phone in hand, having spent the last few minutes researching the actual FAA regulations regarding personal items and carry-on restrictions. According to the Department of Transportation's passenger rights regulations, there are no additional fees for personal items that meet size requirements regardless of their construction materials, she said, her lawyer voice cutting through Rebecca's bureaucratic double-talk with the precision that came from years of dealing with people who tried to hide behind policy when they couldn't defend their positions logically. "Are you calling me a liar?" Rebecca demanded, her professional composure beginning to crack under the pressure of being challenged by passengers who clearly knew more about airline regulations than she'd expected. "I've been doing this job for 18 years, and I know what the policies say. I don't need some passenger telling me how to do my job just because they think they're smarter than everyone else." The racial undertones in Rebecca's response were subtle but unmistakable to everyone who'd learned to recognize the particular way that black families were often accused of being difficult or thinking they're better than everyone else when they simply insisted on receiving the same treatment as other passengers. Jonathan felt his jaw tighten slightly, recognizing the familiar pattern that he'd hoped to avoid on this family trip. "Ma'am, we're not questioning your experience or your professionalism," Jonathan said, his military training helping him maintain a calm tone, even as he recognized that this situation was moving beyond a simple misunderstanding into something more problematic. "We're simply asking that the same rules that apply to other passengers be applied to our family. If there's a legitimate safety concern about the bag, I'm happy to check it. But the fee you're requesting doesn't appear to be consistent with published airline policies." Isaiah had been standing quietly through the entire exchange, still clutching his backpack and looking increasingly distressed as he realized that the grown-ups were having an argument about something that belonged to him. "Daddy, did I do something wrong?" he asked in a small voice that carried clearly across the gate area and made several nearby passengers turn to look at the 9-year-old boy who was clearly confused about why his backpack had become the center of so much adult conflict. "No, buddy, you didn't do anything wrong at all," Jonathan assured his son, kneeling down to speak to him at eye level while keeping his voice gentle and reassuring. "Sometimes adults have disagreements about rules, but that's not your fault, and you don't need to worry about it. We'll figure this out together, okay?" The tender moment between father and son was witnessed by dozens of passengers, many of whom were now actively recording the interaction on their phones. Rebecca had been watching the family dynamics with growing irritation, feeling somehow that their obvious closeness and mutual support was being performed for the benefit of the gathering crowd rather than representing genuine family relationships. Her own personal struggles had left her cynical about displays of family harmony, and she found herself looking for signs of manipulation or performance that would justify her increasingly hostile attitude toward the Hayes family. "Look, I don't have time for this dramatics," Rebecca announced, her voice carrying the kind of sharp authority that suggested someone who'd decided to end a discussion through force rather than logic. "The bag gets checked and you pay the fee, or your son doesn't board this aircraft. Those are your options. I have a schedule to maintain and other passengers to process, and I'm not going to hold up this entire flight because one family thinks the rules don't apply to them." The phrase "thinks the rules don't apply to them" landed with the particular weight that came from racial stereotypes about black families who insisted on equal treatment, and several passengers in the boarding area exchanged glances as they recognized the coded language that was being used to frame the Hayes family as demanding special treatment, rather than simply asking for fair and consistent application of airline policies. Zoe had been watching the entire interaction with the kind of analytical attention that suggested someone who was learning important lessons about how power worked in the real world, and she spoke up again with the kind of direct observation that children often made when adults were behaving badly. "Why are you being so mean to us? We're just trying to get on the plane like everyone else, and Isaiah's bag is smaller than lots of other people's bags that you already let through." The question was delivered with the kind of innocent honesty that made it impossible to ignore, and Rebecca found herself looking at a 12-year-old girl who was publicly pointing out the inconsistency and unfairness of her behavior in front of an audience that was now actively documenting the entire exchange for potential social media sharing and viral distribution. Rebecca Walsh had reached a moment that customer service representatives across the country faced regularly, but rarely handled well. The point where backing down would require admitting that she'd been wrong in front of an audience, while doubling down would require escalating a situation that was already attracting more attention than any airline employee wanted to deal with during a busy travel day. Her personal stress, professional frustration, and growing awareness that she was being recorded combined into a toxic mixture that pushed her toward choices that would have seemed unthinkable during calmer moments. "You know what Rebecca said?" Her voice rising to a level that carried clearly across the gate area and caused conversations at nearby gates to pause as people turned to see what was causing the disturbance. "I'm done arguing with you people. This flight is closed. You're not boarding this aircraft." Her fingers moved quickly across the computer keyboard behind the podium, making changes to the passenger manifest that would have immediate and irreversible consequences for the Hayes family's travel plans. The word "closed" hung in the air like a bomb that had been dropped into the middle of a routine travel day, and Jonathan felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came from recognizing that a situation had suddenly escalated far beyond any reasonable response to the minor disagreement that had started the entire conflict. "Ma'am, the door is still open, the plane is still here, and our boarding passes are valid," he said, pointing toward the jet bridge where passengers were still walking onto the aircraft. "You cannot close the flight while passengers are actively boarding." "I just did," Rebecca replied with the kind of triumphant smugness that came from wielding power over people who couldn't fight back effectively within the confines of the airline industry's customer service structure. "I removed all 4 of you from the flight manifest. You were argumentative, you held up the boarding process, and I don't feel comfortable having disruptive passengers on my aircraft. Security is on their way to escort you from the gate area." The accusation of being disruptive was particularly insidious because it created a narrative that framed the Hayes family as problematic passengers who had somehow earned their removal from the flight, when in reality they had done nothing more than ask for the consistent application of published airline policies. It was exactly the kind of Kafka-esque customer service nightmare that frequent travelers had learned to fear, where reasonable requests were reframed as unreasonable demands. Alicia felt her legal training kick into overdrive as she recognized the multiple violations of passenger rights that were occurring in real time, along with the potential civil rights implications of a black family being removed from a flight for requesting the same treatment that white families received without question. "Ma'am, you cannot remove confirmed passengers from a flight without legitimate safety concerns, and asking for consistent application of your own policies does not constitute disruptive behavior under any definition that would hold up to legal scrutiny." "Don't you dare threaten me with lawyers," Rebecca shot back, her voice taking on the kind of defensive edge that suggested someone who knew she was on thin legal ground, but had committed too far to retreat gracefully. "I am the gate agent. I am responsible for the safety and security of this aircraft, and I have determined that your family poses a risk to the orderly operation of this flight. That determination is final and non-negotiable." Isaiah had begun to cry quietly, the kind of confused and frightened tears that came from a child who didn't understand why adults were being angry about his backpack, and why the angry lady was saying they couldn't go see Uncle Marcus get his new uniform. His tears were visible to everyone in the gate area, including several passengers who had pulled out their phones and were now actively recording the interaction between a crying 9-year-old boy and an airline employee who was shouting about safety risks. "Daddy, why is she being so mean?" Isaiah asked through his tears, looking up at his father with the kind of absolute trust that children had in their parents' ability to fix problems and make unfair situations fair again. "I just wanted to take Mr. Sparkles on the airplane. I didn't do anything bad." His innocent question carried clearly across the gate area, and several passengers began making audible comments about the obvious unfairness of the situation. Jonathan knelt down beside his son, using his body language to shield Isaiah from the hostile gate agent while speaking in the kind of gentle, reassuring voice that he'd perfected during deployment separations and family emergencies. "You didn't do anything wrong, buddy. Sometimes grown-ups make bad choices, but that's not your fault, and we're going to figure this out together. Can you be brave for me while I handle this situation?" Isaiah nodded through his tears, clutching his backpack tighter as if it were a lifeline. "Security to Gate K-14. Security to gate K-14, Rebecca announced into the microphone, her voice echoing through the terminal with the kind of urgency typically reserved for actual emergencies rather than customer service disputes. I have passengers who are refusing to leave the gate area and are disrupting the boarding process. I need immediate assistance with passenger removal. The security announcement created an immediate buzz of attention throughout the terminal, with passengers at nearby gates turning to see what kind of drama was unfolding at gate K-14. Zoe had been watching the entire situation unfold with the kind of analytical attention that intelligent children brought to adult behavior that seemed illogical and unfair, and she moved closer to her father with a question that cut straight to the heart of the situation. "Dad? Why does she seem so angry and sad at the same time? Like she's being mean to us, but it seems like she's really upset about something else." The observation was delivered with the kind of emotional intelligence that suggested someone who was learning to read human behavior and recognize when adult anger was being displaced onto undeserving targets. The insight from his 12-year-old daughter struck Jonathan as both remarkably perceptive and deeply troubling, because it suggested that this entire confrontation might be less about airline policies and more about personal pain that was being channeled into professional abuse of power. But before he could respond to Zoe's observation, the situation took another dramatic turn as two airport security officers appeared at the gate area responding to Rebecca's call for assistance with what she had described as disruptive passengers. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly," Rebecca said, her voice suddenly taking on a professional tone that suggested someone who was used to manipulating authority figures to support her version of events. "This family has been verbally aggressive. They've refused to follow airline policies, and they're now refusing to leave the gate area after being removed from the flight for safety reasons. I need them escorted from the terminal for the safety of other passengers and crew members." The security officers, both experienced airport employees who had seen every possible variation of passenger disputes, looked at the Hayes family and saw a well-dressed father kneeling beside his crying 9-year-old son. A professional-looking mother holding the hands of two obviously well-behaved children, and a gate area full of passengers who were actively recording what appeared to be an unusual and potentially controversial situation. It didn't look like any security threat they'd ever encountered, but airline employees had broad authority over their operations, and security officers were generally required to support their decisions unless there were obvious signs of abuse or discrimination. Officer Martinez, the senior security officer, approached the situation with the kind of practiced caution that came from years of dealing with airport conflicts that were usually more complicated than they initially appeared. He was a 15-year veteran of airport security who had learned to read situations quickly and accurately, and something about this particular confrontation struck him as unusual from the moment he arrived at the gate area. "Sir, ma'am, I'm Officer Martinez with Airport Security," he said, addressing Jonathan and Alicia with the professional courtesy that experienced security personnel used when they weren't sure whether they were dealing with legitimate troublemakers or passengers who had been caught up in an unfair situation. "I understand there's been some kind of disagreement about boarding procedures. Can you help me understand what's happening here?" Jonathan stood up slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening while maintaining the kind of calm dignity that he'd learned was essential when dealing with authority figures who might be predisposed to see black men as threatening regardless of the actual circumstances. "Officer, we're scheduled passengers on Flight 847 to Atlanta. We went through normal boarding procedures, but the gate agent decided to charge an additional fee for my son's backpack, which clearly meets all size requirements. When we asked for clarification about the policy, she removed us from the flight and called for security." Rebecca immediately jumped in, with her version of events speaking quickly and urgently, in the way that people did when they were trying to establish their narrative before anyone else could present alternative facts. "Officer, this family has been argumentative and disruptive from the moment they approached my gate. The father became verbally aggressive when I explained standard airline policies, and they've been holding up the boarding process and causing a scene that's making other passengers uncomfortable. I removed them for safety reasons, and now they're refusing to leave the gate area. Officer Martinez looked around the gate area, noting the dozens of passengers who were actively recording the interaction on their phones, the obvious distress of the crying 9-year-old boy, and the calm, professional demeanor of the family that had been accused of being disruptive and aggressive. His experience told him that truly disruptive passengers usually displayed very different behavior patterns than what he was observing from the Hayes family. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification and your boarding passes," Officer Martinez said to Jonathan and Alicia, using the standard security protocol for passenger verification while he tried to sort out what was actually happening in this increasingly complex situation. Jonathan reached into his wallet with careful, deliberate movements, pulling out his driver's license and his phone with their boarding passes displayed clearly on the screen. As Jonathan handed over his identification, Officer Martinez noticed something that made him pause and look more carefully at the documents he'd been given. The driver's license showed Jonathan Hayes, but there was something else in the wallet that caught his attention, a second form of identification that was partially visible behind the driver's license. "Sir, is there something else in there I should be aware of?" Officer Martinez asked, his tone shifting slightly as he recognized the distinctive look of federal credentials. "Yes, officer." "There is," Jonathan said quietly, reaching into his wallet to pull out the black leather credential case that he'd been hoping he wouldn't need to use during this family trip. "I'm Dr. Jonathan Hayes, Senior Inspector with the Federal Aviation Administration. I was traveling as a passenger with my family, but given the circumstances, I think you should be aware of my professional position." He opened the credential case to reveal the gold badge and official identification card that marked him as a high-level federal employee with significant authority over airline operations. The effect of seeing federal aviation credentials was immediate and dramatic, like watching someone flip a switch that completely changed the power dynamics of the entire situation. Officer Martinez straightened up involuntarily, his years of airport security experience telling him that he was now dealing with someone who had the authority to make his job very complicated if this situation wasn't handled properly and fairly. Rebecca's reaction was even more pronounced, the color draining from her face as she realized that she'd been arguing with, removing from a flight and calling security on a federal inspector who had the power to shut down airline operations, initiate federal investigations, and potentially end her career with a single phone call to his supervisors in Washington. The triumphant smugness that had characterized her behavior for the past 20 minutes evaporated instantly, replaced by the kind of panic that came from recognizing that a situation had spiraled far beyond anything she could control or fix. That can't be real," Rebecca stammered, though her voice lacked any conviction as she stared at credentials that were obviously legitimate and official. "You're just a passenger. You were arguing about a bag fee. Federal inspectors don't argue about bag fees." Her voice trailed off as she realized how weak her protest sounded even to herself. "Ma'am, federal inspectors travel as passengers all the time." Officer Martinez explained, his tone becoming more respectful as he processed the implications of what was happening at Gate K-14. "Dr. Hayes, I apologize for any inconvenience. Can you help me understand what led to this situation from your perspective?" The question was asked with the kind of deference that airport security officers used when they realized they were dealing with someone who significantly outranked them in the federal hierarchy. Jonathan looked at his family, seeing Isaiah's tear-stained face, Zoe's confused expression, and Alicia's barely controlled anger at the treatment they'd received, and made a decision that would transform this private family humiliation into a public reckoning with airline discrimination practices. "Officer, I'm going to make a phone call to my supervisor at the FAA Great Lakes Regional Office. This incident involves clear violations of passenger rights, potential civil rights violations, and what appears to be targeted harassment of a federal employee and his family. I think this requires immediate federal oversight. Jonathan pulled out his phone and scrolled to a number saved as Frank, Regional Director, pausing for a moment to look at Rebecca, who was now visibly shaking as she realized the magnitude of what was about to happen. "Ma'am, you should know that what I'm about to do isn't personal revenge. It's a federal investigation into airline practices that may be affecting thousands of passengers who don't have the resources or authority to fight back. You chose to pick this fight with the wrong family on the wrong day." He pressed the call button and put the phone to his ear, his voice carrying clearly across the gate area as dozens of passengers continued recording what was about to become a viral moment that would change everything for everyone involved. "Frank, this is Jonathan Hayes, Inspector. ID Sierra Tango 447 Alpha. I'm at O'Hare Terminal 3, Gate K14, and I need to report a Code 14 situation involving passenger discrimination and interference with a federal employee in the line of duty." Frank Kowalski had been the FAA Regional Director for the Great Lakes region for 12 years, and in that time he'd received exactly 3 Code 14 calls from field inspectors, each one representing a situation serious enough to require immediate federal intervention and potential criminal investigation. When his phone rang with Jonathan Hayes on the line, Frank was sitting in his office in downtown Chicago, reviewing quarterly safety reports and looking forward to a quiet Thursday evening at home with his family. "Jonathan, what's your situation?" Frank asked immediately, switching to the crisp professional tone that FAA officials used when dealing with potential aviation emergencies. Code 14 was reserved for circumstances involving federal employee interference, civil rights violations, or safety concerns that required immediate executive action, and Jonathan Hayes wasn't someone who used emergency protocols lightly. "Frank, I'm traveling with my family as passengers on Skyline Airlines Flight 847 scheduled departure, 4:45 p.m. from O'Hare to Atlanta," Jonathan said, his voice carrying clearly across the gate area where dozens of passengers were now openly listening to what appeared to be a very official and very serious phone conversation. "The gate agent has removed my family from the flight based on fabricated policy violations, filed false security reports, and engaged in what appears to be targeted racial discrimination. She's also interfered with a federal employee and created a situation that requires immediate oversight." Frank Kowalski felt his blood pressure spike as he processed what Jonathan was telling him, not just because of the civil rights implications, but because Skyline Airlines was currently under enhanced federal oversight following a series of safety violations and customer service complaints that had caught the attention of congressional transportation committees. Any additional incidents involving passenger discrimination could trigger a comprehensive federal audit that would cost the airline millions and potentially result in criminal charges for individual employees. "Jonathan, I'm authorizing immediate federal intervention," Frank said, his voice taking on the kind of executive authority that came with managing aviation safety for a region that handled millions of passengers every year. "I'm issuing a ground stop order for Skyline Airlines operations at O'Hare effective immediately. No Skyline aircraft moves until this situation is resolved and I have a complete incident report. I'm also dispatching federal investigators to your location within the hour." The words "ground stop order" created an immediate buzz of attention throughout Gate K14, as experienced travelers recognized the terminology that was usually reserved for weather emergencies, security threats, or major operational failures. A ground stop meant that every single Skyline Airlines aircraft at one of the busiest airports in the world would be frozen in place until federal authorities decided to allow normal operations to resume. Rebecca Walsh watched in horror as her simple power trip over a child's backpack transformed into a federal investigation that would ground an entire airline fleet and potentially destroy her career along with the careers of everyone who had supported her decisions. She could see passengers taking photos and videos that would inevitably end up on social media, creating permanent documentation of what was rapidly becoming the worst customer service failure in Skyline Airlines corporate history. Frank, I also want immediate notification sent to Skyline's corporate headquarters that they have a federal civil rights investigation in progress, and that any attempts to retaliate against witnesses or destroy documentation will result in additional criminal charges. Jonathan continued, his voice remaining calm and professional, even as he methodically destroyed the career of everyone who had participated in discriminating against his family. I'll need the incident commanders for both civil rights violations and federal employee interference, along with documentation specialists for evidence preservation. Keith Rodriguez had been standing behind Rebecca throughout the entire confrontation, and he was now realizing that his failure to intervene when she was clearly violating passenger rights policies had made him an accessory to a federal civil rights violation that could end his career and potentially result in criminal charges. His supervisor training had covered customer service recovery and complaint resolution, but nothing had prepared him for managing a situation that involved federal law enforcement and civil rights investigations. Officer Martinez recognized that his role in the situation had suddenly become much more complex and potentially career-defining, as he was now dealing with a federal employee who had been subjected to what appeared to be clear discrimination and harassment by airline personnel under his jurisdiction. Airport security officers were required to maintain detailed incident reports for any situation involving federal employees, and those reports would be reviewed by federal investigators who had zero tolerance for procedural mistakes or civil rights violations. Dr. Hayes: I want to assure you that airport security will provide full cooperation with the Federal Investigation Officer Martinez, said, his voice taking on the formal tone that security personnel used when they realized they were part of a situation that would be reviewed by federal authorities. I'll need to secure this area as a potential crime scene and ensure that all witnesses are available for federal investigators when they arrive. The transformation of Gate K-14 from a routine boarding area into a federal crime scene happened with surprising speed as Officer Martinez began directing passengers to remain in the area for witness statements, while his partner called for additional security personnel to manage crowd control and evidence preservation. The normal flow of airport operations ground to a halt as travelers realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in commercial aviation. Jonathan looked at his son Isaiah, who had stopped crying, and was now watching the adults around him with the kind of wide-eyed fascination that children displayed when they realized that their parents possessed powers that they'd never suspected. "Daddy, are you like a superhero or something?" Isaiah asked his 9-year-old brain, trying to process how his father had transformed from a passenger being treated unfairly into someone who could make entire airlines stop operating with a single phone call. "No, buddy. I'm not a superhero," Jonathan said, kneeling down to speak to his son at eye level while keeping his voice gentle despite the chaos that was unfolding around them. "I'm just someone whose job is to make sure that airlines treat all passengers fairly and safely. When they don't do that, especially when they're mean to families like ours, I have tools to help fix the problem and make sure it doesn't happen to other people." Zoe had been watching the entire situation unfold with the kind of analytical attention that suggested someone who was learning important lessons about how power worked in the real world, and she spoke up with a question that demonstrated her growing understanding of the complexities of adult behavior and institutional responsibility. "Dad, is this why you always told us to be extra polite and careful in airports? Because you knew that some people might treat us differently, and you wanted to make sure that if something like this happened, no one could say we were being bad." The question revealed a level of awareness about racial dynamics that no 12-year-old should have needed to develop, and it made several nearby passengers look uncomfortable as they realized that the Hayes family had been navigating potential discrimination as a routine part of their travel experience, preparing their children for unfair treatment that they hoped would never come, but knew was always possible. Meanwhile, in Skyline Airlines corporate headquarters in Dallas, emergency alarms were literally ringing as the company's operations center received notification that their entire Chicago hub had been shut down by federal order with preliminary reports indicating a civil rights violation involving a federal employee and potential criminal charges for multiple airline personnel. The stock market had already begun reacting to news reports of the ground stop, with Skyline's share price dropping precipitously, as investors realized that the company was facing a federal investigation that could result in massive fines, criminal prosecutions, and permanent damage to their corporate reputation. Rebecca Walsh had spent 18 years working for Skyline Airlines, building what she'd thought was a secure career that would provide stability through her mother's medical crisis and eventually fund a comfortable retirement that would allow her to travel and enjoy the life that she'd been working toward for decades. In the space of 30 minutes, that entire future had collapsed around her like a house of cards being destroyed by a hurricane of federal authority and public accountability. She was still standing behind the gate podium, but her hands were shaking as she realized that dozens of passengers were recording her every move and expression, creating permanent documentation of what would undoubtedly become one of the most notorious customer service failures in aviation history. Her name tag, which had once represented professional authority and job security, now felt like a target that marked her as the central figure in a discrimination scandal that would follow her for the rest of her life. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the computer and provide your employee identification to airport security." Officer Martinez said, his tone professional but firm, as he began implementing protocols for securing potential evidence in a federal civil rights investigation. "This area is now considered a federal crime scene, and all airline personnel involved in this incident will need to be interviewed by federal investigators." The word crime scene sent a chill through Rebecca that had nothing to do with the airport's aggressive air conditioning, as she realized that her decision to remove a family from a flight over a fabricated policy violation had crossed the line from poor customer service into potential criminal behavior. Federal civil rights violations carried serious penalties, including substantial fines and possible prison time, especially when they involved discrimination against federal employees. Keith Rodriguez watched his supervisor remove Rebecca's access credentials and badge, knowing that his own career was likely over as well, since he'd supported her decisions despite clear evidence that she was violating passenger rights policies. His failure to intervene when he knew Rebecca was wrong would be documented in the federal investigation, and airline companies had zero tolerance for supervisors who enabled discrimination or civil rights violations. As the immediate chaos of the federal intervention began to settle into the methodical process of evidence collection and witness interviews, Jonathan Hayes found himself looking at Rebecca Walsh and seeing not just someone who had discriminated against his family, but someone whose personal pain and professional frustration had led her to make choices that would destroy her life more thoroughly than any external punishment could accomplish. "Mrs. Walsh," Jonathan said quietly, approaching the gate podium where Rebecca was standing alone, having been abandoned by her colleagues and supervisors as soon as they realized the legal implications of being associated with her actions. "I want you to know that this isn't personal for me. This is about making sure that what happened to my family doesn't happen to other families who don't have the resources or authority to fight back." Rebecca looked up at Jonathan with eyes that were red from tears she'd been trying not to shed in front of the cameras that continued recording her every move. I didn't know you were a federal inspector," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was just trying to do my job. My mother is in the hospital, and I've been under so much stress, and I know that's not an excuse, but I never meant for it to go this far." Isaiah had been watching the conversation between his father and the gate agent who had made him cry, and he tugged on Jonathan's shirt with the kind of gentle insistence that children used when they had something important to say. "Daddy, why is she so sad? Is she in trouble because of my backpack?" His innocent question carried clearly in the quiet gate area, and several passengers looked uncomfortable as they realized they were watching a child show more compassion than most adults would have managed in similar circumstances. "She's sad because she made some bad choices. Buddy Jonathan explained to his son, keeping his voice gentle while making sure his words carried to the adults around them who were learning important lessons about accountability and consequences. Sometimes, when grown-ups are dealing with difficult things in their personal lives, they make mistakes at work. But that doesn't make it okay to be mean to other people, especially children who haven't done anything wrong. Zoe had been observing the interaction with her characteristic analytical attention, and she spoke up with a question that demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence for a 12-year-old who had just experienced discriminatory treatment. "Dad, do you think she was being mean to us because she's hurting about something else, like maybe she wasn't really angry about Isaiah's backpack, but she was angry about other things, and took it out on us instead?" The insight from his daughter struck Jonathan as both accurate and deeply troubling, because it highlighted the way that personal pain could be transformed into professional discrimination when people in positions of authority weren't given adequate support for their personal struggles or proper training for managing their professional responsibilities under stress. "You know what, Zoe? I think you might be right about that," Jonathan said, looking at Rebecca with a mixture of sadness and recognition. Sometimes people who are dealing with difficult situations in their personal lives end up treating other people unfairly because they're looking for ways to feel like they have control over something. But that doesn't make it okay, and it doesn't mean we should ignore it when it happens. Rebecca had been listening to the conversation between Jonathan and his children, and she found herself crying openly as she realized that the family she'd treated with such casual cruelty was showing more understanding and compassion for her situation than she'd shown them when they were simply asking for fair treatment. "Dr. Hayes, I am so sorry," she said, her voice breaking as she finally allowed herself to acknowledge the full magnitude of what she'd done. "You're right that I was dealing with personal problems, but that's not an excuse for how I treated your family. Your children deserve better, and I'm ashamed of what I did." The apology was witnessed by dozens of passengers who continued recording the interaction, creating documentation of a moment of genuine remorse that would become an important part of the narrative that emerged from this incident. But Jonathan knew that personal apologies, while important, weren't sufficient to address the broader issues of discrimination and bias training that had created the conditions for this situation to occur. "Mrs. Walsh, I appreciate your apology, and I hope you get the help you need for your personal situation," Jonathan said, his tone remaining professional despite the emotional weight of the moment. "But you should know that this incident is going to trigger a federal investigation of airline industry practices that goes far beyond what happened here today. This is about making sure that families like mine aren't subjected to discrimination simply because someone is having a bad day or dealing with personal stress." The investigation that followed the incident at Gate K-14 unfolded with the methodical thoroughness that characterized federal civil rights enforcement involving multiple agencies, including the FBI, the Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Office, and the FAA's Regulatory Enforcement Division. Within 72 hours of Jonathan's phone call to Frank Kowalski, Rebecca Walsh found herself facing federal criminal charges that could result in substantial fines and potential prison time. The charges were serious and comprehensive, reflecting the federal government's commitment to protecting both passenger rights and the safety of federal employees. Count 1 was interference with federal officers in the performance of official duties, a felony that carried a maximum sentence of 3 years in federal prison. Count 2 was deprivation of rights under color of law, stemming from her use of her position as an airline employee to discriminate against the Hayes family. Count 3 was filing false reports with law enforcement based on her claims that the family had been disruptive and threatening when they had simply asked for fair treatment. Skyline Airlines faced its own federal investigation with Department of Transportation auditors, combing through years of customer service records, training protocols, and employee performance evaluations to determine whether Rebecca's behavior represented an isolated incident or part of a broader pattern of discriminatory treatment that required regulatory intervention. The airline's stock price continued to plummet as investors realized that federal civil rights investigations could result in massive fines, operational restrictions, and long-term damage to the company's reputation. The media attention surrounding the incident was intense and sustained, with major news networks featuring the story as an example of ongoing discrimination in the travel industry and the power of social media to document and publicize civil rights violations in real time. The video footage captured by passengers at Gate K-14 had been viewed millions of times across multiple platforms, sparking national conversations about racial bias, customer service accountability, and the importance of federal oversight in protecting passenger rights. But for the Hayes family, the most important conversations were happening around their kitchen table in their suburban Chicago home, where Jonathan and Alicia were helping Zoe and Isaiah process what they'd experienced and understand the broader implications of their father's decision to use his federal authority to address discrimination rather than simply accepting unfair treatment and moving on with their lives. "Dad, what's going to happen to Mrs. Walsh?" Isaiah asked during dinner. 3 days after the incident, his 9-year-old sense of justice, struggling with the complexity of a situation where someone who'd been mean to him was now facing serious legal consequences that seemed much bigger than what she'd actually done. "Is she going to jail because of my backpack?" The question revealed the burden that children often carried when adult conflicts centered around them feeling responsible for consequences that were actually the result of adult choices and behavior. "No, buddy. She's not going to jail because of your backpack," Jonathan explained patiently, using the teachable moment to help his son understand the difference between causes and consequences. "She might face legal consequences because of the choices she made about how to treat our family. Adults are responsible for their own decisions, especially when they're in positions where they have power over other people. She chose to be unfair and discriminatory, and those choices have natural consequences." Zoe had been thinking about the incident with the kind of analytical depth that her parents had learned to encourage and guide, and she brought up issues that demonstrated her growing awareness of social justice and civil rights history. "Dad, how many other families do you think have been treated like that, but didn't have a federal inspector as their father? Like, how many people just had to accept being treated unfairly because they couldn't fight back?" The question struck at the heart of what Jonathan had been thinking about since the incident occurred. The recognition that his family's experience was probably representative of treatment that many other families had received without having the resources or authority to seek accountability and justice. The power dynamic that had protected his family was exactly the kind of privilege that wasn't available to most passengers who faced discrimination or unfair treatment from airline employees. "That's exactly why I decided to make this a federal case instead of just filing a complaint and moving on," Jonathan told his daughter, recognizing her growing understanding of systemic issues and social responsibility. When people in positions of authority abuse their power, especially when they target families based on race or other protected characteristics, it's important to create consequences that will prevent the same thing from happening to other people who don't have federal badges to protect them. Alicia had been using her legal expertise to follow the federal investigation and its broader implications for civil rights enforcement in the travel industry, and she brought a lawyer's perspective to the family discussions about justice, accountability, and the importance of transforming individual incidents into opportunities for broader social change. "What happened to our family was wrong, but it's also an opportunity to improve the system for everyone," she explained to her children. "Sometimes when bad things happen to us, we can use those experiences to make sure that good things happen for other people in the future." The conversation around their dinner table was interrupted by a phone call from an unexpected source, a representative from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People who had been following the case and wanted to discuss the possibility of using the Hayes family's experience as part of a broader campaign for civil rights reform in the transportation industry. The organization was interested in transforming the incident from an individual case of discrimination into a catalyst for policy changes that would protect future passengers from similar treatment. Jonathan found himself grappling with questions about privacy, public advocacy, and the responsibility that came with having the resources and authority to fight discrimination in ways that weren't available to most families who faced similar challenges. The decision about whether to become public advocates for transportation civil rights would affect not just his own career and family privacy, but also the broader movement for accountability and reform in industries that had historically been resistant to federal oversight. The conversation that followed was one that many families never had the opportunity to have a discussion about using personal pain and discrimination as motivation for social change, rather than simply seeking individual justice and moving on with their lives. It was a conversation about privilege responsibility and the ways that individual experiences of injustice could be transformed into collective action for civil rights reform. As they talked around their kitchen table, the Hayes family began to understand that their experience at Gate K-14 was becoming something much larger than a travel disruption or even a discrimination case. It was becoming a teachable moment for an entire industry, and a reminder that accountability for civil rights violations required not just legal consequences for individuals who discriminated, but cultural changes that addressed the underlying biases and training failures that made discrimination possible in the first place. 6 months after the incident at Gate K-14, the Hayes family found themselves sitting in a conference room at the Cook County Courthouse, participating in a court-mandated mediation session that represented a new approach to addressing discrimination cases through restorative justice rather than purely punitive measures. The mediation had been requested by Rebecca Walsh's attorney as an alternative to a trial that would have resulted in almost certain conviction and substantial prison time for her federal civil rights violations. The mediator was Dr. Sarah Chen, a professor of conflict resolution at Northwestern University, who specialized in cases involving racial discrimination and workplace harassment. She had reviewed all the evidence from the Gate K-14 incident, including the passenger video recordings, airport security footage, and testimony from witnesses, and had concluded that this case presented an opportunity for meaningful dialogue about bias accountability and the possibility of genuine transformation, rather than simply punishment. Before we begin today's session, Dr. Chen explained to the participants gathered around the conference table, "I want everyone to understand that this process is voluntary for all parties, and its success depends on honest communication, genuine accountability, and a commitment from everyone to engage with difficult truths about discrimination and its impact on real families and communities." The room included Jonathan, Alicia Zoe, and Isaiah Hayes, Rebecca Walsh and her attorney representatives from Skyline Airlines, and a federal prosecutor who would ultimately decide whether the mediation process adequately addressed the civil rights violations that had occurred. Rebecca Walsh looked dramatically different than she had 6 months earlier, having lost weight from stress and financial hardship after losing her job and facing substantial legal fees for her defense. Her mother had died 3 months after the Gate K-14 incident, and Rebecca had been forced to sell her home to pay for medical expenses and legal costs, leaving her living in a small apartment and working part-time jobs while awaiting resolution of her federal charges. Mrs. Walsh, Dr. Chen said, addressing Rebecca directly with a tone that was professional but not unsympathetic. "This process begins with you taking full accountability for your actions and their impact on the Hayes family. Can you tell us in your own words what you did wrong and how you think your behavior affected this family, particularly the children who were present during the incident?" Rebecca looked across the table at Isaiah, who was now 10 years old and sitting quietly beside his father, and felt tears begin forming in her eyes as she remembered the sight of him crying over his pink, glittery backpack while she shouted about safety risks and policy violations. "I was wrong about everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I targeted your family because you were black passengers in first class, and some part of me resented seeing you in a space that I thought of as being for white people." I made up policy violations, I lied to security officers, and I used my position of authority to humiliate your children because I was angry about my personal life and looking for someone to blame. The admission was more direct and honest than anyone had expected, and it created a moment of silence in the room as everyone processed the significance of Rebecca's willingness to acknowledge the racial motivation behind her behavior rather than hiding behind claims of policy enforcement or customer service protocols. Federal prosecutors rarely heard such clear admissions of discriminatory intent, and the Hayes family had not expected Rebecca to be so forthright about her motivations. Mrs. Walsh Zoe said, speaking for the first time since the mediation had begun, "Can I ask you something?" When Rebecca nodded, Zoe continued with the kind of direct question that only children could ask without sounding accusatory. "Do you still think bad things about black people, or was that day just because you were sad about your mom being sick?" The question was delivered with genuine curiosity rather than hostility, reflecting the emotional intelligence that Zoe had developed through processing her own experience of discrimination. Rebecca found herself looking at a 12-year-old girl who was asking her to examine and articulate her own racial biases with more honesty than she'd ever applied to herself, and she realized that answering truthfully would require acknowledging beliefs and assumptions that she'd never been willing to confront directly. "I think I learned to see black families in first class as somehow not belonging there, like they must have gotten special treatment or were trying to get something they didn't deserve," she said, her voice shaking as she spoke truths that were painful to acknowledge. "I realize now that those thoughts were racist and wrong, and that your family belonged in first class just as much as any other family with first-class tickets." Isaiah had been listening to the conversation with the kind of attention that children brought to discussions about fairness and right and wrong, and he raised his hand like he was in school before asking his question. "Mrs. Walsh, do you think my backpack was really too big, or were you just looking for reasons to be mean to us?" His question was asked without malice, reflecting genuine curiosity about adult behavior that hadn't made sense to his 9-year-old understanding of rules and fairness. "Your backpack was perfectly fine," Rebecca admitted, looking directly at Isaiah while answering his question. "I made up the policy violation because I wanted to assert power over your family and make you feel unwelcome in first class. I'm sorry that I made you cry over something that was never actually a problem. You and your sister didn't deserve to be treated that way, and your parents didn't deserve to be discriminated against because of my personal prejudices and professional failures." Jonathan had been listening to the exchange between Rebecca and his children, and he was struck by the way that their direct questions were eliciting more honest acknowledgement of discriminatory behavior than months of legal proceedings had accomplished. "Mrs. Walsh, I appreciate your honesty about what happened and why you targeted our family," he said, his tone remaining professional despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "But I want to make sure you understand that this wasn't just about one bad day or personal stress. This was about deep-seated racial bias that affected how you saw my family and treated us differently than you would have treated a white family in the same situation." "Dr. Hayes, you're absolutely right," Rebecca replied, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the mediation had begun. "I can't blame my racism on stress or personal problems. I made assumptions about your family based on your race, and I used my position of authority to act on those prejudices. That was wrong, and it was harmful, and I take full responsibility for the discrimination and humiliation that I caused." The acknowledgement was clear and unambiguous, providing the kind of accountability that civil rights cases often struggled to achieve through traditional legal processes. Dr. Chen had been facilitating the dialogue with careful attention to the power dynamics and emotional undercurrents that were shaping the conversation, and she recognized that the session had reached a crucial point where genuine accountability was creating opportunities for healing rather than just punishment. "Mrs. Walsh, accountability is important, but this process is also about transformation and making amends for the harm that was caused. What are you prepared to do to demonstrate that your understanding of these issues has changed and to help prevent other families from experiencing the discrimination that the Hayes family faced. Rebecca had been thinking about this question for months, recognizing that any meaningful resolution of her case would require more than just apologies and legal settlements. Dr. Hayes: I know that nothing I do can undo what I did to your family, but I want to spend whatever time I have left working to prevent other airline employees from making the same mistakes I made. She said, her voice growing stronger as she articulated her commitment to change. I want to speak at bias training sessions, share my story as an example of how discrimination hurts real families, and help airlines develop better training programs for recognizing and preventing racial bias in customer service. The mediation session at the Cook County Courthouse became a catalyst for changes that extended far beyond Rebecca Walsh's individual case, transforming how the airline industry approached bias training, customer service, accountability, and federal oversight of passenger rights enforcement. The Department of Transportation used the Hayes family's experience as the foundation for new regulations that required comprehensive civil rights training for all airline personnel and established clear protocols for addressing discrimination complaints in real time rather than after the fact. Skyline Airlines, facing potential federal sanctions and ongoing congressional scrutiny, implemented the most comprehensive anti-discrimination training program in the aviation industry, hiring Dr. Chen's conflict resolution firm to develop protocols that emphasized restorative justice and community healing rather than purely punitive measures for addressing bias incidents. The program became known as the Hayes Protocols, named after the family whose experience had revealed the need for fundamental changes in how airlines trained employees to recognize and prevent discriminatory behavior. Rebecca Walsh became an unexpected advocate for civil rights reform in the transportation industry, speaking at training sessions across the country about her own experience with racial bias and the importance of creating systems that prevented discrimination rather than simply punishing it after it occurred. Her presentations were powerful and emotionally honest, providing airline employees with first-hand understanding of how personal prejudices could manifest in professional discrimination that caused real harm to families and communities. I want every airline employee in America to understand what I learned too late. Rebecca would tell training audiences, her voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse and hard-earned wisdom. When you see a black family in first class and your first thought is that they don't belong there, that thought is racism. When you look for policy violations that you wouldn't apply to white passengers, that behavior is discrimination. And when you use your professional authority to act on those biases, you're not just hurting one family, you're perpetuating a system that treats people differently based on the color of their skin. The transformation wasn't limited to training programs and policy changes, but extended to fundamental shifts in how airline industry leadership approached diversity inclusion and customer service accountability. CEO Thomas Mitchell, who had taken over Skyline Airlines after the previous leadership was forced to resign in the wake of the federal investigation, made civil rights compliance a central part of the company's mission statement and business strategy. The Hayes family taught us that excellent customer service isn't just about efficiency and profitability. Mitchell would later explain to industry conferences, it's about treating every passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, their appearance, or our assumptions about whether they belong in certain sections of our aircraft. We failed that fundamental test, and we've spent the last year rebuilding our company culture from the ground up to ensure that failure never happens again. Jonathan Hayes found himself serving on multiple industry advisory committees and federal oversight boards, using his expertise as an FAA inspector and his experience as a discrimination victim to help develop policies that protected passenger rights while maintaining operational efficiency and safety standards. His unique perspective as both a federal aviation official and a family that had experienced discrimination provided credibility and insight that proved invaluable in crafting regulations that were both effective and practical. What happened to my family wasn't unique or extraordinary. Jonathan would tell congressional committees during testimony about transportation discrimination. It was the predictable result of an industry that hadn't prioritized civil rights training or created meaningful accountability for discriminatory behavior. The changes we've implemented aren't just about preventing future incidents like ours. They're about creating a culture of inclusion and respect that makes air travel better for everyone. The Hayes children became powerful voices in their own right, speaking to youth organizations and schools about the importance of standing up to discrimination and the ways that individual experiences of injustice could be transformed into opportunities for social change and community healing. Zoe, now 13, had started a student organization focused on restorative justice in schools, while Isaiah's natural compassion and emotional intelligence made him an effective advocate for treating people with kindness even when they made mistakes. My dad always tells us that the most powerful response to hatred isn't more hatred, but the kind of love that changes people's hearts. Isaiah would tell elementary school assemblies, his now 11-year-old voice carrying wisdom that impressed educators and inspired other children to think about discrimination and forgiveness in more nuanced ways. Mrs. Walsh was mean to our family because she had wrong ideas about black people, but when she learned better, she became someone who helps other people learn better too. The federal investigation of Skyline Airlines had revealed patterns of discriminatory behavior that extended far beyond Rebecca Walsh's individual actions, leading to a comprehensive settlement that included $50 million in fines, 3 years of federal oversight, and the establishment of an independent civil rights monitoring system that would serve as a model for other transportation companies facing similar challenges. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than regulatory. A shift in how airline employees, passengers, and industry leaders thought about the relationship between customer service and civil rights. The viral video from Gate K-14 had been viewed over 100 million times, creating a shared cultural reference point for discussions about discrimination, accountability, and the importance of treating all travelers with dignity and respect. Airlines across the industry began recruiting more diverse staff, implementing bias training programs, and creating clear protocols for addressing discrimination complaints before they escalated into federal investigations. The changes weren't perfect or universal, but they represented meaningful progress toward creating a transportation system that truly served all passengers equally, regardless of their race, appearance, or economic background. The most powerful testament to the transformation came from passenger feedback and discrimination complaint statistics, which showed significant reductions in reported bias incidents across the entire aviation industry in the 2 years following the Hayes family's experience at Gate K-14. Families that had previously accepted unfair treatment as an inevitable part of air travel began speaking up when they encountered discrimination, knowing that their complaints would be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. 2 years after the incident that had transformed their family from private travelers into public advocates for transportation civil rights, the Hayes family found themselves once again at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, preparing for a flight to Atlanta to attend Isaiah's science fair presentation at a national competition for young innovators. The irony of returning to the same airport where their lives had changed so dramatically wasn't lost on any of them. But this trip felt different, infused with a sense of purpose and accomplishment that had grown from their decision to transform personal discrimination into community healing. Gate K-14 had been renovated since their last visit with new signage that prominently displayed passenger rights information in multiple languages, and a digital display that showed real-time updates about civil rights compliance and bias reporting procedures. The Hayes protocols that had emerged from their experience were now visible throughout the terminal, with clear instructions for passengers who experienced discrimination and contact information for federal oversight offices. Jonathan approached the gate agent's podium with his family, noting that the woman behind the counter was Sarah Chen, a young Korean-American woman who couldn't have been more than 25, and who wore a pin on her uniform jacket that read Civil Rights Advocate beneath her standard Skyline Airlines name tag. The pins had become part of the airline's rebranding effort, a visible commitment to the values that had emerged from the federal investigation and industry transformation. "Good afternoon, Dr. Hayes," Sarah said, recognizing the family immediately, and speaking with the kind of respectful professionalism that suggested someone who understood the significance of treating every passenger with dignity, while being particularly mindful of the history that connected this family to her airline's commitment to civil rights reform. "We're honored to have your family flying with us today. I have you confirmed in seats 2A through 2D, and I want to personally ensure that your travel experience reflects the values we've committed to as a company." Isaiah, now 11 years old and carrying a new backpack that was decidedly less glittery but equally cherished, looked up at the gate agent with the kind of direct eye contact that suggested someone who had learned important lessons about standing up for himself while maintaining respect for others. "Thank you, Ms. Chen. My backpack is definitely the right size this time," he said with a smile that carried just a hint of the humor that came from processing difficult experiences through time and healing. "Actually," Sarah replied, kneeling down to speak to Isaiah at his eye level, in the way that customer service professionals had been trained to do when interacting with child passengers. "I can see that your backpack is perfect, just like I'm sure it was the last time you were here. All of our gate agents have been trained to apply policies consistently and fairly, and we've learned that treating passengers with respect is always the right approach, regardless of the size of their luggage or the color of their skin." The exchange was witnessed by dozens of other passengers, many of whom recognized the Hayes family from media coverage of their experience and the subsequent industry reforms that had emerged from their decision to fight discrimination rather than accept it. Several travelers approached them during the boarding process to express appreciation for their advocacy and to share their own experiences of improved treatment from airline personnel. Dr. Hayes: "I just wanted to thank your family for what you did," said Maria Rodriguez, a Latina businesswoman who had experienced her own discrimination incidents in the past. "I travel for work constantly, and I've noticed a real difference in how airline employees treat passengers of color since your story became public. My daughter and I were on a flight last month where a gate agent went out of her way to help us with a connection issue, and I couldn't help thinking that she might not have been so helpful 2 years ago." The conversation continued as passengers boarded the aircraft with family after family, sharing stories of improved treatment and expressing gratitude for the changes that had emerged from the Hayes family's willingness to transform personal pain into community advocacy. The boarding process proceeded smoothly and professionally, with gate agents checking documentation efficiently while maintaining the kind of respectful courtesy that had become the new standard across the industry. As they settled into their first-class seats, Zoe looked out the window at the busy terminal and reflected on how much had changed since their last visit to this airport. "Dad, do you think Mrs. Walsh is working today?" she asked, knowing that Rebecca had been hired by Skyline Airlines as a civil rights training specialist after completing community service and bias education programs as part of her plea agreement with federal prosecutors. "Actually, she is," Jonathan replied, checking his phone where he'd received a message from Rebecca earlier that morning. "She's conducting a training session for new employees this week, and she wanted me to let you know that she thinks about our family often and remains grateful for the grace you showed her during the mediation process. She said that working in civil rights training has given her life more meaning and purpose than she ever found in gate operations." The conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice over the aircraft's PA system as Captain Maria Santos welcomed passengers aboard and provided the standard safety information with a notable addition that had become part of Skyline Airlines' routine announcements since the implementation of the Hayes protocols. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for departure, I want to remind all passengers that this airline is committed to treating every traveler with dignity and respect regardless of their background or appearance. If you experience or witness any form of discrimination during your travel with us, please don't hesitate to speak with any crew member or contact our civil rights office immediately." The announcement was followed by a brief video presentation that featured Rebecca Walsh speaking about the importance of recognizing and reporting bias incidents, along with testimony from passengers who had experienced improved treatment as a result of the industry reforms. The video had become a standard part of the pre-flight experience on all Skyline Airlines flights, a visible reminder of the company's commitment to the values that had emerged from their failure to protect the Hayes family from discrimination. As Flight 847 prepared for takeoff, Isaiah looked around the first-class cabin and noticed something that made him smile with satisfaction. The section was filled with families of diverse backgrounds, including several black families with children who were clearly comfortable and confident in their right to occupy premium seating without justifying their presence or defending their belongings against discriminatory policy enforcement. "Dad, look around," Isaiah said quietly, gesturing toward the other passengers with a sense of pride and accomplishment. "Everyone belongs here, and everyone knows they belong here. That's different from before, isn't it?" His observation reflected the kind of wisdom that came from experiencing discrimination and then witnessing the transformation that could emerge from choosing accountability over acceptance, education over punishment, and community healing over individual revenge. Jonathan looked around the cabin and realized that his son was absolutely right that the changes they had fought for were visible in the relaxed confidence of families who no longer had to worry about being singled out for discriminatory treatment simply because they were traveling while Black, Latino, Asian, or any other identity that had historically been subjected to unfair scrutiny in transportation settings. As the aircraft lifted off from O'Hare International Airport carrying the Hayes family toward their destination, along with dozens of other families who were traveling with dignity and confidence, Jonathan reflected on the journey that had begun 2 years earlier with a 9-year-old boy's pink, glittery backpack and had evolved into a nationwide conversation about civil rights accountability and the possibility of genuine transformation in American institutions. 3 years after that humid Thursday at O'Hare, the aviation industry had fundamentally changed in ways that extended far beyond policy manuals and training programs. The Hayes protocols were now federal law requiring comprehensive bias training for all airline personnel and establishing clear accountability measures for employees who engaged in discriminatory behavior. Rebecca Walsh had become an unlikely but powerful advocate for civil rights reform, her transformation from perpetrator to educator serving as proof that people could change when confronted with the consequences of their actions and given opportunities for meaningful redemption. She had rebuilt her relationship with her estranged daughter and found purpose in preventing other families from experiencing the discrimination she had once inflicted. Dr. Jonathan Hayes continued his work as an FAA inspector while serving on the Federal Transportation Civil Rights Advisory Board, ensuring that the changes sparked by his family's experience became permanent rather than temporary reforms. Alicia had established a pro bono legal clinic specializing in transportation discrimination cases, providing resources for families who didn't have federal credentials to protect them from unfair treatment. Zoe had founded a national youth organization focused on restorative justice in schools, while Isaiah's natural compassion led him to volunteer with community mediation programs that helped resolve conflicts through dialogue rather than punishment. Their parents were immensely proud of how their children had transformed trauma into purpose and advocacy into healing. The legacy wasn't just policy changes or viral videos, but the quiet transformations in hearts and minds that occurred when people chose education over ignorance, accountability over defensiveness, and community healing over individual revenge. Airport employees thought more carefully before making assumptions about passengers based on race or appearance. Travelers stood up more frequently when they witnessed discrimination, knowing their voices would be heard and their complaints would be investigated. And somewhere in a training facility in Chicago, Rebecca Walsh was teaching a new group of airline employees that the most important rule in customer service wasn't about bag sizes or policy enforcement, but about treating every passenger as a human being deserving of dignity and respect. Sometimes the most powerful victories weren't about destroying your enemies, but about helping them become better versions of themselves, creating a world where 9-year-old boys could carry pink, glittery backpacks onto airplanes without fear, and where every family could travel with confidence that they belonged, wherever their tickets said they belonged. If this story of transformation and justice inspired you, please hit that like button to help more people see how courage and compassion can change entire industries. Share your thoughts in the comments about how you've seen positive change in your own travel experiences, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that show how ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept discrimination and choose healing over hatred.